the term lost colony was first used by a woman. This is a period when women were just beginning to write for magazines and be able to earn a living as writers. And so a series of women over the decades began to tell stories about the lost colony. We didn't know what happened to them, so they kind of made up these mythical stories, kind of ghost stories, that appeared in magazines and newspapers around the country. And one of the early stories was about the lost colony and Virginia Dare. Virginia Dare was, as far as we know, the first English child born in the New World. All we know about her is that she was John White's granddaughter, and John White was there for her christening in 1587. Then he got on a ship and left. What happened to Virginia Dare, we don't know. So she became this kind of projection screen on which women of that era could project to all kinds of stories. And there were so few women in early American history that Virginia Dare offered the possibility for women to feel involved and feel like they had too had participated in American history, which of course they had. They simply were forgotten. So Virginia Dare became a very big deal. Like Pocahontas, she became a mythical figure that most school children would have known about in the 19th century. And that was the case until later in the 19th century, when the image of Virginia Dare takes a darker turn. So keep in mind, Virginia Dare was a child born in 1587. She was baptized. We know her name. We know her parents. We know that John White was her grandfather. We know nothing else. But by the 19th century, at the end of that time, she was a symbol of white supremacy. She was this blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl who was trapped, lost on an island surrounded by dark savages. And the more I dug into this story, the more I realized that Virginia Dare says way more about this country in the 19th century than it does about Elizabethans way back in Elizabethan times. And why is that? Well, because at that period in the late 1800s, the first Jim Crow laws were coming into effect. And particularly in North Carolina and Virginia and throughout the South, it was becoming increasingly difficult for blacks to vote. It was increasingly difficult for them to have any civil rights whatsoever. And in the North, you had this huge wave of migrants coming in. Now, we forget, we're talking 1 million people a year coming from places like Italy and Spain, Eastern Europe, lots of Jews, and this was creating all kinds of anxiety among white Americans. So many people seized on Virginia Dare as a sign of the fragility of white power, basically, in America, and that it was threatened by these dark savages. So I was really astonished to find out that this figure, who had been a mythical figure in my childhood, actually had been kind of hijacked to serve the needs of white supremacy in the late 19th century and well into the 20th.
Well, you've mentioned before a manufactured lore, a mythology of the Lumbee that suited almost similar ends. How did Virginia Dare as a symbol fare throughout the rest of history? What do we know of her today? Is she still an emblem?
If you follow the story of Virginia Dare, you can follow the anxieties, if you will, of American attitudes toward race and immigration. This is what makes her so fascinating. And it's not as if her role as a symbol of white supremacy ended in the early 20th century. In fact, what I discovered was that she's still very much alive and very much used by white supremacists today, or white nationalists, if you prefer. And there's even a website called vdare.com that is based on this idea that America is threatened by an influx of dark people, people of color, who are coming into this country and destroying its nationalist traditions. So you see Virginia Dare as less an Elizabethan and more as a child who is used for whatever political purposes people see fit. Now, among feminists, Virginia Dare has emerged as a symbol of a competent young girl who was able to make her way, didn't need the help of men, and she was able to thrive in the wilderness of Roanoke Island. So the story of Virginia Dare is a wonderful way to look at who we are today, much more so than who she might have been back in Elizabethan times. And this is part of what makes the Lost Colony, I think, so fascinating to so many people.
Well, let's talk about your fascination with the Lost Colony and where you've ended up. Lots of theories, lots of evidence. But what do you think happened to the Lost Colony of Roanoke?
The fact is, the Lost Colony never got lost. answer to this mystery has been staring us in the face from the very beginning. But it's been obscured by our own confusions about race and immigration. And let me tell you why. We know that later Europeans who came to America often would desert and leave behind their European friends and neighbors and move in with the Indians. Sometimes they were taken by force. But even if they were taken by force, after a period of time, they often did not want to return to wearing heavy woolen dresses or wearing leather shoes or having to live in a very hierarchical kind of society. So we know that many voted with their feet to go live with Native Americans. And this fact was covered up. It was embarrassing to people to admit this. It was very embarrassing for the English and other Europeans to admit that their own people were deserting to live with people who actually knew how to make a living in terms of gathering the foods that were necessary in order to survive and prosper. So we know that this was going on in the 1600s. 1700s, and out west it was going on well into the 19th century. Many stories of white people who became part of Indian tribes. As long as you could learn the language and you understood the stories and you had a skill, you were often accepted. Now, it's true that if you were a male warrior age, you might be killed, but the women and children often were considered to be an advantage. You wanted to have more people in your tribe. So white people did quite well, often in Native American tribes. So if we know this to be